What would you do if the love and passion you once shared with your partner slowly faded into nothing but routine? How far would you go to feel desired again? For Claire Donovan, a beautiful housewife trapped in a loveless marriage, the answer came in the form of a handsome stranger and Italian repairman who would change her life forever. Claire had it all: wealth, a successful husband, and a life of luxury. But inside, she was starved for affection, yearning for the spark that had long disappeared from her marriage. Her husband, Mark, was always away, consumed by his business, leaving Claire to wrestle with her deepening loneliness and burning desire for more. Then, one fateful afternoon, Antonio appeared at her doorstep. With his smoldering eyes and rugged charm, he was everything Claire craved. What started as a harmless encounter quickly spiraled into a passionate affair that would lead to a deadly confrontation in their own kitchen. What happens when forbidden desire turns into a deadly obsession? How far can love and lust push someone to the brink of destruction? As their affair intensifies, Claire and Antonio's secret love will ignite a chain of events that ends in bloodshed, leaving lives shattered and a once perfect facade destroyed. But in the end, was it worth it? This is a story of passion, betrayal, and the dark consequences of following your heart when it leads you down a dangerous path. Prepare to be consumed by the fire of Claire's burning desires and the deadly choices that follow. Claire Donovan stood in front of her bedroom mirror, running her fingers absent-mindedly through her long hair. She stared at her reflection, feeling an emptiness she could no longer ignore. In her early 40s, Claire was still stunning, her figure slim, her face radiant, but there was a hollow ache inside her, a deep yearning that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Her husband, Mark Donovan, had once been everything she desired. A charming businessman, he swept her off her feet in their early days with romantic weekends, candlelit dinners, and stolen kisses under the stars. But those days were long gone. Mark had built a successful real estate firm, and now his life revolved around contracts, meetings, and clients. He traveled frequently, always busy with deals and developments, leaving Claire alone in their spacious home. He provided everything: material luxury cars, designer clothes, vacations to exotic destinations, but what she craved was something far more intimate. The love, the passion, the desire. It had all slipped away. Their physical relationship had withered into nothing more than routine, a mechanical act that left Claire feeling more alone than before. Mark barely touched her anymore, his attention always focused on his phone or laptop, even in bed. She would lie next to him at night, aching for him to reach out, to pull her close, but his arms remained still. The man who once couldn't keep his hands off her now barely noticed her presence. Claire wanted more than this. She needed more. Her fantasies began to consume her thoughts, filling her lonely hours with images of what she longed for: a man who would look at her with raw desire, someone who would take her in his arms and make her feel alive again. She dreamed of stolen moments, secret touches, forbidden kisses, and the rush of adrenaline that came with being wanted. The more Mark neglected her, the stronger her desires became, until they were all she could think about. One chilly afternoon, the kitchen sink broke. Water dripped steadily onto the floor, the sound echoing through the silent house. Claire sighed in frustration and called Mark, who was away on yet another business trip, this time in Chicago. "I'll send someone to fix it," he said, his voice distant, as though the sink was the last thing on his mind. "Just wait until tomorrow. I'm in a meeting." Claire hung up, her frustration deepening. She was used to waiting for everything: for attention, for affection, for love. But tomorrow came, and with it, someone far more intriguing than she had ever expected. That afternoon, the doorbell rang, and when Claire opened it, she found herself staring into the most captivating pair of deep brown eyes she had ever seen. "Hello, I'm Antonio," the man said with a thick Italian accent, flashing her a polite but charming smile. His dark hair, neatly combed, framed his ruggedly handsome face, and his muscular build was apparent even under the simple work clothes he wore. He was younger than Mark by at least a decade, his skin sun-kissed and his eyes filled with warmth. For a moment, Claire was speechless, taken aback by the intensity of her own reaction to him. He was the embodiment of everything she had been yearning for: exotic, strong, and undeniably attractive. Her heart raced as he stepped into the house, carrying his toolbox, unaware of the fire he was about to ignite. As Antonio bent over to inspect the sink, Claire found her gaze lingering on him far longer than it should have. His hands were large, strong, capable. The curve of his back, the way his muscles flexed with every movement, sent a rush of heat through her. Her desires, so long suppressed, stirred violently inside her, making her breath quicken. She couldn't stop thinking about him even after he left, his polite goodbye, Mom echoing in her ears long after the door had closed. That night, lying next to Mark's cold, unresponsive body, Claire's mind wandered to Antonio, the way his dark eyes had met hers, the way he moved, the temptation that seemed to hang in the air between them. The next day, with Mark still away, Claire made a decision she knew would change everything. She called Antonio under the pretense of needing more repairs, but it wasn't the sink she wanted fixed. When he arrived, she greeted him at the door in nothing but a towel, her wet hair cascading down her shoulders, her skin glistening. Antonio's eyes widened slightly as he took in the sight of her, his gaze lingering just a little too long. "I just got out of the shower," she said, her voice soft, almost teasing. "I hope you don't mind." Antonio swallowed hard, his usually steady hands faltering for a moment. He nodded, clearly flustered but trying to maintain his professionalism. "Of course, Ma, I am." But Claire knew she had him. She could see it in the way he looked at her, now the way his eyes followed the curve of her body as she turned to lead him into the kitchen. Her heart raced with anticipation. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, every nerve in her body buzzing with desire. She slipped into a tight, revealing dress, one she knew would drive him wild. When she returned to the kitchen, Antonio's breath caught in his throat. There were no words after that. Claire moved closer, her hand brushing against his arm, and then their lips collided. The kiss was fierce, fueled by the lust that had been building inside her for so long. Antonio responded in kind, his hands roaming her body, his touch igniting every inch of her skin. In that moment, she didn't care about Mark, about the consequences, or about anything other than the heat of Antonio's embrace. The affair had begun, and Claire knew there was no turning back. It didn't take long for the heat between Claire and Antonio to become unbearable. From the moment their lips had first met, the unspoken understanding was clear this was no innocent flirtation. It was desire, raw and unfiltered, the kind of passion Claire hadn't felt in years. Every glance, every accidental brush of hands, only served to fan the flames that had been smoldering between them since that fateful day. Days passed, but Claire couldn't shake the thought of Antonio. When Mark was away on business, her thoughts were consumed by the young Italian repairman who had awakened something in her she thought had died. She found excuses to call him back to the house little things, like a broken faucet or a loose hinge, but it wasn't the repair she craved. It was him, his presence, his touch, the electricity that sparked between them with every word exchanged. One afternoon, with Mark out of town again, Claire made a decision she knew would change everything. She called Antonio, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for him to arrive. This time, there was no pretense, no facade of needing repairs. She wanted him, and she knew he wanted her too. The doorbell rang, and when she opened it, Antonio stood there, his dark eyes filled with the same desire she felt burning inside her. There were no tools this time, no repair job to be done. The air between them crackled with tension, the unspoken agreement hanging heavy in the silence. "Is something broken?" Antonio asked, his voice low, thick with his accent. But there was a knowing gleam in his eyes. "Yes," Claire replied, her voice barely above a whisper as she stepped aside to let him in. But not the sink. The door clicked shut behind him, and for a moment they stood there, the anticipation building, the tension palpable. Claire's breath hitched as she looked at him, her pulse racing. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the way her body responded to just being near him. Without another word, Claire moved closer, her hand grazing his arm. The touch was light, teasing, but it sent a jolt of electricity through both of them. Antonio inhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his own desire. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, trailing down to her neck. Claire shivered, leaning into his touch, her heart hammering in her chest. Then, in one swift motion, their lips collided. It was like a dam breaking. The kiss was hungry, desperate, full of the passion they had both been holding back for too long. Antonio's hand slid around her waist, pulling her closer, and Claire melted into him, her body pressing against his as the kiss deepened. Her hands roamed over his chest, feeling the solid muscles beneath his shirt. Antonio groaned softly, his hands moving down to the curve of her hips, squeezing gently as he pushed her back against the wall. The intensity of the moment consumed them both, their kisses growing more urgent, more needy. Claire gasped as Antonio's lips left hers, trailing down her neck, his breath hot against her skin. "You're so beautiful," he whispered against her collarbone, his accent thick with desire. Claire could only moan in response, her hands tangling in his hair as he kissed his way down her chest. Every touch, every kiss sent waves of pleasure coursing through her, making her tremble with anticipation. Antonio's hand slipped under her dress, his fingers brushing against the soft skin of her thighs, and Claire's breath hitched. Her whole body ached for him, her skin tingling with need. She had never felt anything like this before, this all-consuming hunger, this primal desire that left her dizzy and breathless. As his hands moved higher, Claire let out a soft moan, her head falling back against the wall. Antonio's lips found hers again, the kiss slow and sensual, their tongues dancing in a rhythm that mirrored the growing heat between them. "I've wanted you since the moment I saw you," Antonio murmured against her lips, his voice husky with need. "You drive me crazy, Claire." "I want you too," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her racing heartbeat. "I need you." With that, Antonio lifted her up effortlessly, carrying her to the kitchen counter where their affair had begun. He set her down, his hands sliding up her thighs as he stood between her legs, their bodies pressed tightly together. The intensity of the moment was overwhelming. Claire's hands fumbled with the buttons of his shirt, desperate to feel his skin against hers. Antonio kissed her deeply, his lips claiming hers with a ferocity that left her breathless. She moaned into his mouth, her fingers finally freeing his shirt and pushing it off his shoulders. Antonio's hands slid under her dress again, pulling it up over her head in one swift motion, leaving her exposed before him. He paused for a moment, his eyes raking over her body with undisguised desire. "You're perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with lust. Claire blushed, her body tingling under his gaze. She reached out, pulling him closer, her lips finding his once again as their hands explored each other's bodies. The heat between them was unbearable now, their desire a roaring inferno that threatened to consume them both. They moved together in a fevered dance of passion, their hands and lips never leaving each other's skin. Claire's moans filled the kitchen, her body arching against his as the intensity of their lovemaking reached its peak. Antonio's hands gripped her hips, pulling her closer as they moved in perfect sync, their bodies becoming one in the heat of their desire. Claire gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts as she reached the edge, her body trembling with pleasure. Antonio followed soon after, his own groans of pleasure mingling with hers as they collapsed against each other, spent but satisfied. For a long moment, they stayed like that, their bodies entwined, their breaths heavy in the quiet kitchen. Claire's heart was still racing, her skin still tingling with the aftershocks of their lovemaking. She had never felt anything like this before, this raw, intense passion that left her feeling alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Antonio kissed her softly, his lips brushing against hers in a tender, lingering kiss. "This is just the beginning," he whispered against her lips, his voice full of promise. "I'm not letting you go." The affair between Claire and Antonio had quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. What had started as a brief moment of lust had now consumed them entirely. Every time they were alone together, the attraction was magnetic, irresistible, and they couldn't keep their hands off each other. Their stolen moments of passion became more frequent, more daring, and far more intense. It wasn't just the excitement of their secrecy that fueled the fire, it was the undeniable chemistry between them. Antonio awakened something in Claire that she hadn't felt in years: desire, raw and unrestrained. Every time they met, the need to be together, to feel each other's skin, became all-consuming. It started in the kitchen, where their affair had first begun. The cool marble countertop became a place of endless encounters, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows as Antonio pressed her against it, his hands roaming over her body with a hunger that left her breathless. The harshness of the stone beneath her only seemed to heighten the intensity of their passion. Each time he lifted her onto the counter, his grip firm on her hips, she would wrap her legs around him, pulling him closer, their bodies perfectly aligned. The first time they made love in the kitchen, it was rushed, frenzied, as if they couldn't get enough of each other fast enough. Antonio had torn off her clothes, his lips trailing fiery kisses down her neck, over her breasts, down the curve of her stomach. His hands were everywhere, touching, exploring, while Claire arched beneath him, her body responding to his every touch. Their breaths were ragged, their moans filling the room as they moved together in perfect rhythm. The second time, they took their time. It was late evening, and the kitchen was bathed in the soft glow of the overhead lights, casting a warm, intimate atmosphere over their secret meeting. Claire wore a simple silk robe, the thin fabric barely covering her body. When Antonio arrived, his eyes darkened with desire at the sight of her. She had waited for him, standing by the kitchen island, her heart racing in anticipation. He walked toward her slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the weight of their mutual desire. When he reached her, Antonio gently untied the knot of her robe, letting it slip to the floor, leaving her completely exposed before him. His hands trailed down her arms, slow, deliberate, as if savoring every inch of her skin. Claire shivered under his touch, her body trembling with anticipation. They didn't speak, there was no need for words. Antonio lifted her onto the island, the cool surface a sharp contrast to the heat building between them. His lips met hers in a deep, languid kiss, his hands gripping her thighs as he positioned himself between them. Claire moaned into his mouth, her fingers threading through his hair as the kiss deepened, her entire body responding to him. They made love slowly that night, their bodies moving in perfect harmony, the soft light casting shadows over their skin. Antonio's hands were gentle but firm, his lips never leaving her skin as he trailed kisses down her neck, her collarbone, her breasts. Claire's moans grew louder as the intensity of their lovemaking built, each thrust sending waves of pleasure coursing through her. Her breath hitched as Antonio whispered her name, his voice thick with desire. "You're incredible," he murmured against her skin, his accent sending shivers down her spine. They moved together, their bodies entwined, the connection between them electric. Every kiss, every touch, was charged with the intensity of their secret affair, and with each encounter, their passion only grew stronger. Antonio's hands gripped her hips, his movements becoming more urgent as they both neared the edge. When they finally reached their climax, it was explosive. Claire cried out, her fingers digging into Antonio's shoulders as she trembled beneath him, her entire body shaking with pleasure. Antonio groaned softly, his own release following soon after, their bodies collapsing against each other in a tangled mess of limbs and sweat. But their affair wasn't limited to the kitchen. They explored every corner of the house in secret, finding new places to indulge their passion. The living room, bathed in the soft glow of the fireplace, became another favorite spot. Antonio would pull her onto the plush rug in front of the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows over their skin as they kissed, their bodies pressed tightly together. The first time they made love in the living room, it was late at night. The house was silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the soft gasps and moans as they explored each other's bodies. Antonio's hands roamed over her curves, his lips trailing kisses down her spine as he laid her gently on the rug. The heat from the fire mirrored the heat between them, their bodies moving in sync as they gave in to the overwhelming desire that consumed them. Claire's breath came in short, sharp gasps as Antonio's lips found hers again, the intensity of their passion building with each kiss, each touch. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her closer, his movements slow and deliberate, driving her wild with anticipation. She moaned softly, her fingers digging into his back as their bodies moved together, the flames casting a warm glow over their naked skin. Every encounter was different, but the intensity never waned. In the bedroom, they took their time, savoring every moment. Antonio would undress her slowly, his hands exploring every inch of her body as if memorizing it, his lips following the path of his hands, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. They would make love slowly, their bodies moving together in a sensual dance, their kisses deep and lingering. Antonio's touch was gentle but firm, his hands gripping her thighs, her waist, as they moved together in perfect harmony. Claire's moans filled the room as she arched beneath him, her body trembling with pleasure. Every kiss, every touch, was charged with the intensity of their forbidden affair, and with each encounter, their passion only grew stronger. Even in the smallest moments, the heat between them was undeniable. A stolen kiss in the hallway, a brush of hands as they passed each other in the kitchen, the lingering touches that left them both aching for more. The more time they spent together, the more reckless their affair became. It was no longer just about lust, it was about the thrill of being wanted, the danger of being caught, and the deep, unspoken connection that had formed between them. But as their affair grew more intense, so did the risk. Claire knew that their stolen moments of passion couldn't last forever, and with every passing day, the danger of being discovered loomed larger. Yet in Antonio's arms, she didn't care. The passion, the intensity, the desire, they were all too powerful to resist. It was supposed to be a normal evening for Mark. He had wrapped up his work trip a day early, eager to surprise Claire. He'd been absent so often, buried in the demands of his growing real estate business. The strain had become noticeable in their relationship. Claire had grown distant, cold even, but Mark convinced himself it was temporary, that they'd find their way back to each other. He just needed to make more time for her. As he drove through the darkening streets toward their suburban home, he imagined how surprised she'd be when he walked through the door earlier than expected. He'd pick up her favorite wine from the corner store, and maybe they'd talk, reconnect. Perhaps they could even rekindle the spark that had faded over the years. But as Mark parked his car in the driveway and approached the house, something felt off. The lights in the kitchen were dimmed, casting a soft, warm glow through the windows. Through the gap in the curtains, he noticed movement inside, but it didn't register at first. He paused, his brow furrowing as he took in the scene unfolding before him. There in his own kitchen stood Claire, but she wasn't alone. Antonio the repairman was with her, and the sight of them together sent a jolt of confusion and disbelief through Mark's body. Claire was perched on the kitchen counter, her head thrown back in ecstasy, her hands gripping Antonio's shoulders as their bodies moved together in an intimate rhythm. The silk robe she wore had slipped off her shoulders, exposing her bare skin to the stranger who had no right to be there. Antonio's shirt was open, his hands gripping Claire's waist as he pressed her against the counter, his lips trailing fiery kisses down her neck. Mark's heart raced, his mind refusing to comprehend what he was seeing. His wife, his Claire, in their kitchen, with another man. His breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They were making love. Right there on the counter where they had shared countless dinners, laughs, and memories. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, and Mark found himself rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to speak. The sounds of their moans, their gasps of pleasure, filled the air, echoing in Mark's ears. Claire's fingers tangled in Antonio's hair, her soft cries of pleasure growing louder with each movement. Antonio's hands slid under her, gripping her thighs as he lifted her, his movements becoming more urgent, more intense. Mark's vision blurred with rage. He couldn't take it anymore. The betrayal, the humiliation, it was too much. His hands shook as he fumbled with the doorknob, throwing the door open with a force that sent it crashing against the wall. The sound startled them both. Claire gasped, her eyes widening in shock as she turned to see her husband standing in the doorway, his face twisted in a mixture of fury and disbelief. Antonio froze, his hands still on Claire's body, his shirt half undone, his eyes darting between Mark and Claire. "What the hell is this?" Mark's voice was a low growl, barely containing the storm of emotions raging inside him. His fists clenched at his sides, his entire body trembling with anger. Claire scrambled off the counter, pulling her robe around her body, as if it could somehow erase what had just happened. But it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no going back. Claire started, but she couldn't find the words. What could she possibly say to explain this? Mark's attention shifted to Antonio, his eyes blazing with fury. "Get away from her." Antonio's expression hardened, and he stepped forward, his posture defensive. "It's not what you think," Antonio started, but the lie died on his lips. What excuse could there be? The truth was laid bare before them. Mark's body moved before his mind could catch up. He lunged at Antonio, fists swinging wildly as years of frustration, betrayal, and anger came boiling to the surface. Antonio dodged the first punch, but the second landed squarely on his jaw, sending him staggering back against the counter. "Mark, stop!" Claire screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the sounds of the scuffle. Antonio recovered quickly, pushing Mark back with a force that sent him stumbling. The two men circled each other, their breaths heavy, the tension crackling between them. Mark swung again, but this time Antonio was ready. He grabbed Mark's arm, twisting it behind his back, forcing him down onto the floor. Claire watched in horror as the fight escalated, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what was happening. How had everything spiraled so far out of control? Mark struggled against Antonio's grip, his face contorted in pain and rage. "You ruined everything," he shouted, his voice thick with emotion. "You think you can just come into my home and take what's mine?" Antonio's eyes flashed with anger as he tightened his hold on Mark. "You don't deserve her," he spat, his voice low and menacing. "You didn't even see what you had until it was too late." In the chaos, Mark's hand found the edge of a kitchen knife lying on the floor, a remnant from earlier in the day. Without thinking, he grabbed it, slashing wildly in Antonio's direction. Antonio reacted instinctively, grabbing Mark's wrist and twisting it until the knife clattered to the floor. But the struggle for control sent them both crashing into the kitchen table, the force of the impact sending dishes and glasses flying. In the scuffle, Antonio's elbow struck Mark hard across the face, and Mark went down, hitting the corner of the counter with a sickening thud. He lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath him, his chest still. Claire screamed, rushing to her husband's side, but it was too late. The life had drained from Mark's eyes, leaving behind only the shell of the man she had once known. For a moment, there was only silence. Antonio stood frozen, staring at the lifeless body of the man he had just killed. His breathing was ragged, his mind racing as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. "We have to go," Antonio said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." Claire's heart raced, her mind spinning with shock and terror. She looked at Mark's body, then back at Antonio, the weight of the situation pressing down on her like a heavy stone. She knew he was right. There was no going back now. With shaky hands, Claire grabbed her purse and followed Antonio out the door. They fled into the night, leaving behind the wreckage of their lives, the broken marriage, the shattered home, and the body of the man whose love had been smothered by betrayal. They didn't know where they were going or what would happen next, but one thing was certain: their lives would never be the same again. Antonio and Claire had fled into the night, leaving the scene of their crime behind. For days they lived in the shadows, moving from one cheap motel to the next, consumed by fear and guilt. The thrill that had once driven their affair had been replaced by the weight of what they'd done, the consequences now looming over them like a dark cloud. It wasn't long before the authorities caught up with them. Mark's body had been discovered the morning after the murder by a concerned neighbor who had heard the commotion. The police found the kitchen in disarray, blood staining the floors, and the front door left ajar. It didn't take long for them to piece together what had happened. Claire and Antonio had left behind too much evidence: fingerprints, traces of their presence throughout the house, and the connection between them had been obvious from the start. Within a week, Claire and Antonio were tracked down. Their faces had been splashed across news outlets, and it wasn't long before a tip led the authorities to the rundown motel where they had been hiding. Claire was the first to see the police lights flashing outside the window, her heart sinking as she realized their time had run out. "Antonio, they found us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Antonio, his face pale and lined with exhaustion, looked out the window, knowing there was no escape this time. He nodded slowly, the fight drained from him. "It's over," he said, his voice hollow. "We have to face this." They didn't resist when the police burst through the door. Claire, tears streaming down her face, surrendered quietly, her hands shaking as the cold metal of handcuffs snapped around her wrists. Antonio remained stoic, accepting his fate without a word. The gravity of their crime had sunk in, and there was no more running from it. The trial that followed became a national spectacle. Claire, a once respected housewife, and Antonio, an Italian immigrant with no prior record, had been thrust into the spotlight. The media painted them as the ultimate villains, a couple whose forbidden affair had ended in murder, leaving behind a trail of destruction. In court, the prosecution laid out the grim details of the case. They described the affair in lurid detail, painting Claire as a woman driven by lust and Antonio as the willing accomplice. They recounted the brutal fight between Antonio and Mark, highlighting the cold-bloodedness of the killing. Antonio had overpowered Mark, and when the fight had turned deadly, he had fled with Claire, leaving Mark's body to be found by others. Witnesses were called to testify, including Mark's friends and family, who spoke of his devotion to Claire, his hard work to provide for their family, and his tragic death at the hands of a man who had destroyed his marriage. Claire's defense tried to spin a different story, painting her as a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, seeking affection and love from a man who gave her the attention her husband had denied. They argued that the killing had been unintentional, a result of the heat of the moment and self-defense. Antonio's defense followed a similar path, emphasizing that the murder had not been premeditated. But the prosecution was relentless. They showed the evidence of Claire's premeditated seduction of Antonio, using the allure of her body to pull him into her web. They also focused on the fact that Antonio, instead of calling for help after the fight, chose to flee with Claire, proving that he was fully complicit in the crime. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached a verdict. Claire and Antonio were found guilty of second-degree murder. Claire, whose role in the affair and flight was seen as equally culpable, was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Antonio, who had delivered the fatal blow, was given a life sentence. The courtroom was filled with tension as the sentences were handed down. Claire wept openly, her once beautiful face now gaunt and hollow from the stress of the trial. Antonio remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor, accepting his fate without a word. The public reaction to the verdict was mixed. Many saw them as monsters who deserved every day of their sentences, while others felt some sympathy for Claire, viewing her as a victim of neglect who had made a terrible mistake. But no matter the opinion, one thing was clear: the lives of everyone involved had been shattered beyond repair. For Claire, life in prison was a slow, painful descent into regret and despair. The initial thrill of her affair with Antonio had long since faded, replaced by the crushing weight of her guilt. She had not only lost her husband, but had thrown away her entire life for a man who, in the end, couldn't save her. Antonio, once the object of her burning desire, had become a reminder of everything she had lost. Mark's family, still reeling from his tragic death, struggled to come to terms with the loss. They visited his grave often, speaking of the kind, hardworking man they had loved and how his life had been stolen by betrayal. Their grief was deep, and though justice had been served in court, it did little to heal the wounds left behind. Antonio's life behind bars was a shadow of what it once was. The passion he had felt for Claire had evaporated, leaving him with nothing but time to reflect on his actions. He had been lured by her beauty and the promise of something more, but now he was paying the price for letting lust cloud his judgment. The affair that had once burned so brightly had ended in the darkest way possible. And for Claire and Antonio, the passion they had shared would forever be tainted by the blood they had spilled, a reminder of how quickly desire can lead to destruction.